Thank you, everybody, for coming. We are going to have a very good discussion tonight. Before we begin, I just want to say a few things. I want to thank Edward from Turning Point and Philip from the College Republicans for hosting this event. I hope the irony is not lost on anyone that 3 liberal atheists are being sponsored. Their event is being sponsored by the most conservative groups on campus. I hope that that irony is not lost, and I think it is perfectly indicative of the sign of the time. So a sincere thank you for reaching out to us for the olive branch. So thank you. So tonight we're going to talk about, is intersectionality a religion? We'll run it for about an hour, and then we'll run about 50 minutes to an hour for Q&A. This is something that I've been thinking about extensively, and both James and Helen have been thinking about extensively. Oh, did we do intros yet?
Yeah, you really right by him.
Intros, sorry.
All right,
let's do it.
So, Dr. Peter Boghossian, the man on the far right. I couldn't resist.
Good.
Dr. Peter Boghossian is a full-time faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at Portland State University. He's an international speaker for the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Science and Reason and the Center for Inquiry, and has an extensive publication record across multiple domains of thought. He's the author of A Manual for Creating Atheists and the creator of the Atheos app. Helen Pluckrose is an exile from the humanities with research interests in late medieval / early modern religious writing for and about women. She is critical of post-modernism and cultural constructivism, which she sees as currently dominating the humanities. She's an editor at Arrow magazine. Did I pronounce that right, or is it Arrow? Arrow magazine.
I do it too.
James A. Lindsay, actually Dr. James Lindsay.
Yeah, doctor, that's whatever.
Is a thinker, not a philosopher,
Right.
with a doctorate in math and a background in physics. He's the author of 4 books, most recently, Life in Light of Death. His essays have appeared in Time, Scientific American, and the Philosopher's Magazine. He is lead author of The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct, and thinks everybody is wrong about God. Please give the panelists a warm round of applause again.
All right, thanks. So let's get right into it. So let's talk about some terms, let's disambiguate, let's do some definitions, and then we're going to drill down. Intersectionality, we hear it all the time, it's a buzz, we're surrounded by it. Helen, what is intersectionality?
Intersectionality is a hermeneutic which was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. It looks at the different ways in which people can be marginalised. She was a lawyer, and she looked at discrimination that could affect women of colour, which couldn't be put down to either being women or being of colour. So she looked at quite a few cases and proved quite successfully that it was possible for people to be discriminated against in a way that wasn't actually covered by law. Now, a lot of people, Crenshaw, she also went on to develop critical race theory, and her work has been taken in all sorts of directions, as well as the intersections of gender and race. There is sexuality, there is gender identity, there is disability, and to a very, very slight degree, there is class, but that's often overlooked. So intersectionality is pretty much the intersection of where all these different marginalised identities can mingle and sort of coalesce in hierarchies of oppression. And it's come a long way since Crenshaw. It's got increasingly competitive and contradictory, and it takes in all sorts of post-colonial theory and queer theory and is really quite messy now.
And we'll try to talk about some of those later.
Yeah.
James, add to that. Help us out.
Yeah, actually, my background's in math. If you don't care, I'll draw a picture real quick.
Please do.
So, kind of an easy way to understand intersectionality is kind of with a Venn diagram. This is a quick math quiz. Who knows what a Venn diagram is? Okay, most of you, good. So if you've seen those things with the overlapping circles that are all over, then those are Venn diagrams. So I'll draw 3. So you can imagine that this circle represents the entire set of, let's say, people of color. And then you have an overlapping circle. This represents all women. And then you can have maybe another one, and we'll say that this is disability, for example. And so in mathematics, we look at, say, the set of persons of color and women, and we say the people who happen to be both. So for example, Latino women, black women would fall into this category, fall within the intersection of those two sets. That's the mathematical term for the overlap between the two sets. It's always a smaller, or it's always either the same size or smaller, the intersection set is, than either of the sets that form it. If we add in disability status, so that we add, say, that we have a person of color who is a woman who's also disabled, that's this little segment in here. And so what intersectionality is doing is kind of cutting identity groups down and looking at the smaller segments that are in overlapping identities. What Crenshaw didn't actually come at this from intersection via math, so maybe that's my bias that I saw the term immediately in terms of mathematics. She talked about it in terms of roads.
Would you mind diagramming the roads for us?
Sure, yeah. So we could actually, for Crenshaw's idea, we could take, we'll just use 2 because it's going to get really ugly if I try to draw 3-dimensional roads. We'll use a road that indicates, say, women.
At first, those were just the 2, race and gender.
And then race. So we have, those are stop lines. So then you have a road where women can be discriminated against. You can imagine getting hit by a car. This is Crenshaw's metaphor. Getting hit by a car on this road would be gender discrimination. Getting hit by a car on this road would be race discrimination. And then you have this poor, say, black woman in the intersection of the two sets. So this women's road is this circle. This race road is this circle. And then this poor person's in the intersection here. That's another way of picturing it. What Crenshaw's argument was is that the person here can get hit by race, or can get hit by gender, and won't actually necessarily know which problem got her. And furthermore, because there's these intersectional oppressions that you can't know, you don't know where to look to see the car for sure that might be coming to hit you, that they suffer actually even greater oppression than you would have by being just a woman or just of some oppressed race.
And could you please, anybody, go into how she came up with this idea of black women and black men and hiring?
Yeah, the cases that she looked at and the discrimination that she talked about was because feminism at that time, it was looking at mostly at stereotypes of white women, which had them as passive and unadventurous and generally just sort of letting life happen to them, very placid. But the stereotype for African American women was very different. There was a prejudice against them on a stereotype of being aggressive and particularly of being sexually aggressive. And this prejudice was affecting women who weren't being given jobs in offices that white women would be given, and black men didn't have that stereotype, so they were not being discriminated against on factory floors. And this was a specific problem, and there just wasn't any way to address it. So the beginnings of intersectionality really was addressing something that there was no way to address, but it's because Crenshaw drew on post-modernism, the idea that race and gender are culturally constructed. There's nothing innate about them at all. But her concern was that postmodernism didn't allow for addressing realities at all. Everything had to be deconstructed. And to her, these clusters of power, that privilege that went with certain groups, were a very real social reality. So she left postmodernism to some extent to say some things are real, prejudice is real, privilege is real, but we still maintained the whole social construct of gender and race.
All right, so I think, you want more intersectionality, or my next thing is I'm going to go right to the religion. You want more unpacking of intersectionality, or is that good for now? Good for now. All right, good. So, 3 liberal atheists sitting on a Jim, give us what is religion? It's a disambiguate that. It's a tricky term.
Religion's actually, so to give you guys some background on why I would tell you what a religion is, I've spent several years studying religious psychology and moral psychology with kind of a keen research interest. And so I'm coming at it from those perspectives. Religion is a very difficult construct to define, and in fact, people who study the psychology of religion from an empirical standpoint almost refuse to do so. They will say that any definition of religion that says, oh, a religion is just, and then fill in the blank with, it could be a very long, chapter-long, book-length explanation, probably is going to miss something from some religion, somewhere. So it's very difficult to define a religion. That said, religions are studied empirically in terms of a number of different traits that they exhibit. They tend to be meaning-making structures, but at their very bottom, the way that they act as meaning-making structures are as communities. In fact, they are communities organized around certain moral principles that are often derived from scripture or doctrine. So you have scriptural or doctrinal, actually I'll give a second. No, you're good. You're fine. Good. Welcome. So you have scriptural or doctrinal definitions of what moral structure there is. These are used in order to define, shape, and enforce the boundaries of a community. These communities are called moral communities in general, and religions equip them with a dogma or a doctrine or a scripture that gives them an inherent ideology. Usually religions have a feature that they describe that in a mythological or poetic way. A lot of times it's deities, gods. It doesn't have to be. Buddhism doesn't necessarily have gods. It can be practiced religiously without gods. Sometimes the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so on are deified or reified, or they're raised up to a kind of god or demigod type status. But not always. Same with religious Taoism. So it doesn't have to rely on gods. It just needs a mythological structure that distinguishes it from other ideological mechanisms like, say, political parties, which are also often moral communities that enforce their boundaries and so on. They have specific features. They tend to focus on moral purity for the in-group. They tend to demonize the out-group. They especially demonize heretics or blasphemers or anybody who goes too far outside of that dogmatic, often, structure of belief that threatens it. Those people are often excommunicated. So these kinds of structures are very prominent within religions. These communities exist. They didn't come out of a vacuum, or if you maybe believe that they were handed down from God as a liberal atheist, I don't. They evolved alongside human cultures in order to solve certain social and psychological problems that people all have. We have needs, we need order, we need structure in society. We need to understand our place in a community and how we fit into the community, how to relate to one another. We need to have a sense that there is control over the universe, that in where I come from in the Southeast, that Jesus can take the wheel. And I say that because it was just in the news that somebody tried that in my state of Tennessee recently, and it didn't work out good.
They crashed into something?
They crashed, yeah. Went right off the road, it turns out. He was called to have Jesus take the wheel and went right off the highway, as a matter of fact. So that's like a sense that the universe has control. Things won't get too bad. God bless America is sort of a slogan that speaks to that. Or in God we trust is another slogan. It's on the wall at my post office, which I don't know if that's like a violation or not, but it is because I'm in the South. It's also a national motto, so here we are. They also look for control in an active sense, intercessory prayer, for example. Be able to pray on behalf that, let my child not be sick anymore. Please don't let my child die. That's it's an action taken in order to gain a sense of control over uncontrollable circumstances. So we have deep-seated human needs for making meaning out of things, for having control, for finding self-control also. These are okay things. We also have deep-seated human needs for having a community that we can contextualize ourselves in and understand who we are and come together and be social. So these deep-seated psychosocial needs, as it's called, are the underlying purpose from a psychological perspective of why human beings are religious.
Okay, can I just pause? So if you were to just bullet point those, so control,
meaning-making, community.
Meaning-making, community. Okay, so some of the intersections, let's talk about how intersectionality, what features do they share in common? I don't know, who wants to go first?
Well, with as with a lot of ideologies, we have very much the in-group and the out-group. We have the very strong belief with a strong moral element that you are either with us or you're against us. And in James's book, Everybody is Wrong About God, he drew on a few psychologists to show that people associate with God all that is good. And so if when atheists will say that they don't believe in God, they're very often understood to say, I don't believe in good. I'm against anything that's good. And this is also very commonly seen in social justice movements, where to say, I don't like this approach to equality is not to say, well, I prefer a universal liberal, or I am a conservative with a libertarian bent who wants everybody to have the same opportunities. It's essentially to say, I am a Nazi. So that's
so that's one.
That's Satan.
What would be another example?
So another huge thing that religions tend to do is that they tend to create what I've referred to in a couple of things I've written before as an island epistemology. They come up with their own means of producing knowledge that from the outside becomes unfalsifiable or indefeasible. So for example, you've probably often heard religious fundamentalists will accuse, say, atheists or people of other faiths even of not wanting to become a Christian or not wanting to take up the faith because they wish to remain in sin. They desire to be able to be sinners and to enjoy sin, because it's like sin is a relinquishing of self-control. They get to do fun things that I suppose are reserved for heaven. And this situation that we have with intersectionality, there is the same kind of structure going on whereby, say, if you have a, say, disabled black lesbian woman who then takes up a position of free market capitalism and freedom of speech and then says that they think intersectionality is crap, then this person is probably crying out for patriarchal approval, or they're a Uncle Tom, or if it's a Muslim person that wants to secularize, they might be called a house Muslim or something like this. So you have these ways in which they claim to create knowledge and produce knowledge, and people who argue from the outside of that are seen to have some kind of a collusion with what's evil that prevents them from being able to be good. But with intersectionality, this goes far deeper, because the theory behind intersectionality, the epistemology that drives intersectionality, is called standpoint epistemology, which says that your situated standpoint as a person with certain identities gives you certain unique insights into the world. So, for example, the position of standpoint epistemology is that I, as a white man, live in a white man's world. So I have access to the white male perspective, and in my privilege, that's all I can see. And Helen, as a woman, has perspective of the white man's world because she lives in that as well. But she, as a woman, also knows what it's like to be a woman in a white man's world. Therefore, she has a sight that I don't have. She can see the woman's perspective, but it's not possible for me to see that. So my objectivity is limited, whereas hers is enhanced. And if she were also black, then she could see the black perspective as well that I also cannot see. And this is what standpoint epistemology is. It's kind of like color blindness. If I'm colorblind, I can't see any colors, but all of a sudden, by being a woman, you now can see another color. And if she's black, she can see, maybe she's dichromatic at that point. If she were also disabled, then she can have trichromatic, which is what we actually, most humans have, all but maybe like 3 or 4 women. No, sorry boys, you can't be tetrachromats. You can't see 4 fundamental colors, but some people can. Like 2 or 3 women, I think, in the world have been confirmed as tetrachromats. So that would be like adding on a marginalized sexuality, like lesbian. So a disabled black lesbian woman would have like 4 unique perspectives that we, with our privilege, don't have access to. And that's the epistemology. That's the way that they gather and produce knowledge about the world, that the more oppressed you are, the more unique perspectives you have to draw from. And these multiply as you have more of them. And therefore, your opinions become more valid. And therefore, if you are a white man in a white man's world, you need to shut up and listen because you don't know. You can't know, in fact, unless you shut up and listen.
Yeah, it's not so much that people with marginalised identities have an ability to see more. It's that what everybody is supposedly seeing right now is what white Western heterosexual men have said the reality is. So, yeah, if it was a different way, then it would be men who could see things that women couldn't. But as it is now, we are supposedly, this society has supposedly been, and all knowledge has been created by white heterosexual men. And Christy Dotson, who's one of the leading black feminist epistemologists, she actually uses Plato's Cave to describe this, and that the people are all chained in a row, but only the people on the right get to say what they can see. So to her, the people, the further left they get, the more and more marginalised people, they are not believed. They are not listened to. So there's a whole range of what can be seen that isn't joining the shared resources of what can be known. So that kind of makes sense in a way, because, and she really seems quite rigorous. But what we might notice is missing here is any possibility that there is actually an objective reality to see. Everything here comes from a perspective, objectivity, whatever angle we can see it from, that we don't, that doesn't leave space for there actually to be a reality and better and worse ways of accessing it.
Well, there's so much to unpack here.
Well, I mean, the easy thing to say is that this taps into scientific universality. So our science proceeds upon the assumption that it doesn't matter who does the experiment, the same result's going to happen. Reality proceeds according to reality, not according to who's engaging with reality. So if I take some, I don't know if y'all have ever seen this, but if you haven't, if I take some sodium and throw it in water, it's going to start bubbling off hydrogen. It's going to get very hot. It's an exothermic reaction as the sodium rapidly reacts with the I guess, oxygen in the water and oxidizes very quickly, evolves hydrogen, that becomes hot, and then catches on fire. So I'm a white man, and if I throw sodium in water, that's going to happen. Well, if Helen, as a woman, throws sodium in water, guess what's going to happen? Same damn thing. And it doesn't matter if a black person or a person from anywhere in the world at any time who had access to sodium, if they do the same experiment, they're going to get the same result. That's scientific universality. It doesn't matter who does the experiment. If they do the same experiment with the same level of rigor, they should get the same result.
And how does that differ from standpoint theory?
Standpoint theory says that the situated knowledge that a person has gives them an access to claim knowledge in a way that doesn't necessarily work that way.
Okay. So now,
for example,
go ahead.
There's recently, a couple of years ago, there was a YouTube clip from South Africa where people were sitting on a panel and proclaiming that science, Western science, universality assumption of Western science was colonial in the sense that it was oppressing people, say from tribes in South Africa that still believed that you could do some kind of a ritual or an action or a belief and cause an enemy to be struck by lightning. And they said that what was happening by demanding that be evaluated under the scientific method, it was demanding that people adhere to this white masculinist Western-centric view of how the world works while discounting that marginalized knowledge and not letting it have an equal share on the table. So what they're doing there is they're trying to undermine the universality and say that knowledge, the same experiment doesn't necessarily provide the same result for everybody. Instead, what happens is that certain people have certain ways of approaching things and understanding things in which they can derive different knowledge that's equally valid.
All right, so I want to take this conversation down a couple of notches. How's everybody doing, by the way? This is complicated, right? Oh.
This is two complicated things.
These are
intersecting.
Extremely complicated things that we're going to try to make sense of as we put together and we understand the guiding ethos of, well, in my opinion, the age we live in, what comes after postmodernism, and what really has wired itself into our brain modules. But let's bring it down again. In religion, they have blasphemy.
And blasphemy, yeah.
And in intersectionality, what is the method for keeping beliefs in place? What's the parallel?
Political correctness.
Political correctness.
Political correctness is the same mechanism as blasphemy against a religious structure.
Okay, in religion, they have original sin, like Christianity, I'm thinking, the Abrahamic Church, Christianity. What does intersectionality have?
Privilege.
Privilege. Okay, so let's talk for a second about the relationship between privilege and original sin.
Well, in the Christian tradition of original sin, you are born bad. There is a baby, as Augustine said, just has to learn to be good. It will never be perfectly good. Is all constantly fighting against the sinful nature. With privilege, we are understood to be born into a society which is imbalanced, and it's imbalanced in our favour. We can't help but have internalised all these prejudices and assumptions and supposed knowledge which is imbalanced, and be racist, be sexist. There isn't any escape from this. We can try to unpack it, we can try to deconstruct it, we can try to fight it as well as we can.
You're born with the stain of original sin, you're born with the stain of privilege. We should unpack the lexicon too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
there's a lot of parallels in these concepts and terms.
I'm born again. I'm
Woke.
woke is born again. I'm telling you, it's everywhere. Once you see it, it's like the duck rabbit. You know, once you see it, it's like, wow.
And what happens when somebody becomes born again? They become this is religious conversion experiences tend to be very emotional. They tend to make people very zealous and excited. They want to tell everybody about what's just changed their lives, usually for about 18 months, by the way, and then it kind of wears off. It's sort of like falling in love. You might have heard that metaphor before with religion, that they fell in love with, say, Christ, for example. It's sort of like that. It turns out it's the same kind of emotional response often happens. They become very zealous, they become very outspoken, and what happens when somebody becomes woke? Well, now they have to tell everybody, they have to become activists. They've got to enforce that moral purity. Have you heard about your privilege? Have you checked your privilege?
Yeah.
I found mine, and oh my God.
And a lot of that moral purity stuff comes from Jonathan Haidt.
Moral purity, yeah. Jonathan Haidt is a moral psychologist who has studied a lot about how morality works. In particular, he's divided up morality into different moral foundations, and that's probably what he's best known for, but that's not what we're talking about here. So he's got some great stuff about moral foundations theory that he did with Craig Joseph. You can look it up. It's not really particularly relevant here. What's more relevant, he's not as well known for, but his main body of research as a moral psychologist for a long time was actually in feelings of disgust, moral disgust, versus elevation or purity, or versus, I should say, elevation, which is the opposite feeling of disgust. It's that high you get when you're born again, when you're woke, whatever it happens to be. It's that feeling of uplift that's the opposite of being disgusted. And it comes from feeling morally clean, from having your guilt absolved.
So let's just run through the parallels. We've talked about intersectionality, we've talked about religion, we've defined those, we've disambiguated those, we've talked about privilege and original sin, blasphemy and political correctness. We've talked about some couple words from the lexicon. What other commonalities does intersectionality have with religion? And I'm thinking about who went to the Demore event. Oh, wow, okay.
Great.
So I'm thinking about that young woman who ripped off the wires and started screaming about the cis patriarchy, heteronormative capitalist structure. I mean, so I guess the can you relate that? Like, what To me, that's a type of religious fundamentalism.
There's a fervour.
Yeah, but you wouldn't see that at, you know, a cookie baking event. So there's something unique about intersectionality.
Yeah, it threatens moral identity. So religious communities are moral communities that are wrapped around a shared sense of moral identity. And when you threaten somebody's moral identity, especially in religious structures have things tied in like purpose and life, to save the oppressed in this case, and they have making sense of the world, giving your life a sense of meaning, understanding how things work. In this case, the social reality is being interpreted. It's called an attributional schema in the psychological literature. And your identity and your feeling of placement within a supportive community, a supportive moral community of people with shared moral values is easily threatened by people who don't think that your beliefs are legit. The second you run into an infidel or a racist or a sexist or an ableist or whatever it happens to be, the second you run into somebody who threatens your view of the moral world, because morals are very difficult to work out, there can be an identity threat, like my fit into the community, my sense of purpose in life. All of a sudden these start to fall apart, and that is predictably going to cause bad reactions in some people because it's very uncomfortable when it happens. And what you said, it seems like religious fundamentalism, Jonathan Rauch in his book Kindly Inquisitors talks about the fundamentalist impulse. And he talks about liberalism in the broad sense, not liberalism like political Democrats versus Republicans, but liberalism in the sense that Paine and Locke and Mill would have talked about it. So Jefferson, you know, proper open discourse, marketplace of ideas, and so on. And what he says is that liberalism is founded upon these kinds of principles, and there's an underlying fundamentalist impulse that tries to get around the fact that in proper liberalism, we trust a system of discussion, of discourse, to work out our problems, to answer questions about reality. We shave away at what's wrong and try to keep what's right. But other people want to jump in and have final authority. They want to say, as a priest-like figure, they want to say, it's like this, and you have to believe me. You listen and believe, okay? And they're not participating in discourse at that point.
What is that? You have to believe what I say?
They just believe that they have final authority over...
Believe and confirm, or believe in...
Oh, listen and believe is the statement, but that's not how liberalism works. So the intersectional line you often hear is listen and believe, right? You've heard that? Listen and believe, or you've probably heard shut up and listen also.
Sit down and listen.
Sit down and listen is another one, which adds like a metaphorical height element to it, or power element to it. Your story has been heard, so we're going to tell somebody else's story. You've probably heard these things. The liberal answer to that is, well, let's listen and consider. Let's hear you out. Let's hear what your idea is. And now let's hash it out. Let's put that idea to the test. Let's bring anybody who wants to challenge that idea. Let them put up their best arguments, and we're going to keep those ideas that survive this disconfirmation process.
I'm just curious, so if you don't buy into that idea, so when we invited the Women's Studies Department repeatedly to have a conversation with James Moore here, and they don't come, I mean, I can't speak for them, you can't, nobody can speak for them, but at some level, actually I don't even want to say it. So I guess that's the atmosphere is so toxic that if I kind of muse about why I think that is, I'll automatically be painted as a sexist, a racist,
an infidel.
An infidel, yeah, an infidel.
You could
So
talk about hypothetical people who avoid listening to other ideas.
yeah, so I'm hypothetical people who avoid listening to other ideas or accepting conversations. I guess one of the things I want to talk about in terms of parallels too are, what do you think of this? It never ceases to amaze me that people have invented an entire canon of literature. Like, just completely invented it.
Parallel scripture, then.
It's parallel to scripture. It's untethered to reality. It's like people walking on water. And then they use that to credential themselves into academic positions, a body of literature that's basically make-believe land. And that doesn't mean all of it is. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing.
I have tried
right?
to follow it back. I've had people in discussion say, look, I'm going to send you loads and loads of research, and they will send me papers and they will be quoting other papers, and you can try to follow it back and back and back, and you come to so many dead ends because someone's taken something in a different way, and trying to find any substance at the bottom of it is...
So I'm gonna take this on. Our friend Tim Poole is here, and we had a podcast with him last night about this. I'm gonna take this conversation down the little road, another little road. So some folks, think about phrenology. Think about this in terms of phrenology. Phrenology is this fake science of people examining each other's heads for bumps on skulls and such. Think about this. So there's a department of phrenology. Everybody who comes in, they examine your skull. They give you scholarships based upon the size of your skull. If you question the fact that phrenology is bullshit, they tell you, well, you're only saying that because you have that certain shape of your skull. All of their literature is unfalsifiable. If you attempt to, but yet it's fascinating because it's all self-referential. It's like the resurrection of Jesus. It's all finding other people who believe in the resurrection of Jesus and then linking this stuff together. It's total nonsense.
Right, and these all have points of contact with reality, and then build an architecture around it. That's the important part. Like with phrenology, you really do have a skull.
Yeah, exactly.
It really does have a shape. And personalities actually vary and are different. Is there a connection between those two? Well, that's where the bullshit happens.
Right.
Okay, but there really are bumps on the skull, and we could go feel Peter's skull, and we could find a bump at this or that location that corresponds to whatever thing on their chart, and then that happens to be what he has. This is like the astrology thing oh, look, confirmation. That's it. And so there are points of contact all throughout intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw's original thing was that there was a legitimate loophole in the law. Whether or not discrimination actually happened, she looked at three legal cases where black women were being discriminated against, but they had no legal recourse because if they sued for sexism, well, there are plenty of black men working here, no problem. If they sued for, sexism, there are plenty of white women working here, so there's women here, no problem. If they sued for racism, then there's plenty of black men working here, so no problem. And so, sorry, lady, there was no discrimination because the legal structure only allowed for discriminating by race or by sex, but not by both at the same time. So that was like a legit point of contact with reality. But instead of saying, wow, okay, here's a legit point of contact with reality, what do we do with this? It's, oh, feminism by itself is racist. And race theory is got sexism. It serves the black man, race theory does, and feminism serves the white woman. And now we've got to create this whole, new thing to look at this more deeply constructed. So they instead of sticking to reality, they decided to run down the postmodern based critical theory path and just dig deeper into creating a scriptural canon of literature that is essentially this postmodern rooted scholarship that goes all the way back. If we want to talk about where it goes all the way back to, I mean, there's roots behind roots behind roots, but we can go all the way back to the master-slave dialectic of Hegel. That's really where this main thing.
But I don't want to go there yet. I don't want to go yet. I still want to think about, so I'm driving down the car, I still want to think about this path we're on. So we have an entire wing of university architecture that's driven by the moral engines of gender studies. They're indoctrinating people into these ideas. They've changed the meanings of words. They've smuggled in
Trojan horse terms, yeah.
Huh?
Trojan horse terms. Yeah.
Trojan horse terms. Let's unpack that because I think this is important.
I mean, yeah. So moral communities develop specialized terminology, and of course, woke was an example we gave before, and we did the whole thing, privilege and all of this. But all of these things are also equipped with these other, there are other terms that they do on purpose that this is actually called reappropriation of all things, where they take a term that has an existing meaning and usually one that's morally salient that people are going to understand in an intuitive way immediately, give it a new technical definition, and then work it in using the common definition and then enforce the technical definition. Some examples would be replacing the definition of racism with systemic racism so that racism can only go in one direction.
Right.
Another example would be inclusion, meaning it sounds like bring people in and let them be involved, but inclusive actually means that the space has absolutely no language or behavior that might be found offensive to some person of a marginalized identity, or that somebody who is acting on their behalf might project onto even a hypothetical person of that identity. And therefore, inclusion Sounds great. Who wouldn't want an inclusive thing, right? It sounds awesome. Hey, university administrator, we want an inclusive space. Yeah, sign up, right? But inclusive actually means we're going to restrict speech in this space. That's what it means. Speech will be restricted here.
So they don't make up. They have all these terms, these Trojan horse terms. They're smuggling it in. They're making bogus lines of literature, totally untethered to reality. They're then using that to get promotion and tenure. They're influencing university structures.
Building a church.
They're filling a church.
They're building a cathedral.
They're building a cathedral. They don't. But
that's another parallel.
That's another parallel. But the interesting thing is they don't need faith because they just point to their made-up lines of literature. They have their own types of scripture, so they don't need faith. The mechanism. We can talk about the differences in a second, or if people want to hear about that. So then what happens is all of these ideas then leak out. They slowly start seeping out of the university. I have repeatedly asked my colleagues, what is the evidence that you have for microaggressions? And I've shown them evidence against microaggressions. But if you don't form your beliefs on the basis of evidence, what point is it for me to show them peer-reviewed scholarship that shows that microaggressions are, at the very least, highly suspect? Or trigger warnings, or safe spaces. Churches are safe spaces.
Yeah, safe spaces are the churches.
So then they get promotion and tenure. They take over diversity boards. They take over, basically, it's the moral zeitgeist. Now,
right, so I come from the South, right? And
Helen, go ahead.
But I think what's important when we're talking about the zeitgeist to realise is that in mainstream liberalism, we had the civil rights movement, we had the second wave liberal feminism, we had gay pride, which were legitimately universal liberalism. It was a case of everybody should have the same freedoms, opportunities and rights, and some people don't. We need to elevate those people. We need to make things equal. And this worked. This worked well.
Equality.
Yes, equality of opportunity. Now same-sex couples can get married. Now women can earn the same amount as men. Now people of colour have access to all qualifications.
And all three of us think that's fantastic.
That's great.
Yes, yeah, and that was the mainstream liberalism. What intersectionality, and we keep saying intersectionality, but it's because this is a kind of umbrella term. The critical theory which evolved from postmodernism includes post-colonialism and queer theory, but because of the intersections of all these identities, intersectionality really is an umbrella term which can successfully cover all of them. It claims to be taking up the mantle, it claims to be continuing the work of gay pride, civil rights movement, and liberal feminism, but that isn't what it is doing. That is not what it's been doing for some time now.
What's it been doing?
It has, as Crenshaw said. I mean, this is found throughout critical theory, but Crenshaw is useful because she articulated it so well when she said, right, well, we're keeping the cultural constructs, but what we need to do is look at systems and hierarchies of power. We need to increase identity politics. She said...
Can you define that for us, please?
Yeah, identity politics is when you're looking at your rights from a perspective of your race, your gender, your sexuality. It's not the universal liberalism. It's not, I'm a woman and so I should have the same rights as men. It in ever smaller groups and group interests, group perceptions, which all ties in to the epistemology. I think and feel this because I'm a woman. You can't because you're a man. I can't understand your perspective because I'm white. And this is how the identity politics goes. And Crenshaw said, we don't want to be saying I am a person who happens to be black. We want to say I am black. That is the connection, that is the empowering thing. So we have moved on to this now until we have lost a considerable amount of individuality because people in certain categories are expected to think in certain ways, and if they don't, they're not considered to be representative of those categories.
Fascinating, yeah.
And we've lost shared humanity because it is presumptuous for anyone from any group to consider themselves able to understand or empathise with someone from a group considered more marginalised. And the idea that we could actually have the same feelings and understand things that don't affect us is considered problematic now. That's considered
problematic. That's something else.
Yeah,
We problematize everything. Intersectionality. You find something and you have to problematize.
That's the tool. That's the tool. Is to problematize.
Yeah.
Is to find the problems in whatever is, and if you solve the problem, then whatever the solution is, there's a problem in that too.
And there are keywords to learn. There are keywords to this. One is hegemonic.
Is that me? Okay.
Yeah, or anybody, hegemonic.
Yeah, well, hegemonic is the sort of ruling orthodoxy, the thing that's so well established in society we just accept it as true. So to problematize is seen as doing the work of deconstructing things. We're supposed to understand what we know to be true, the values we know to be good, as a construct which need picking at, which need bringing down.
So hegemonic masculinity is just stuff guys do.
Yes.
We got to make a problem of it. We have to kind of problematize that in some way. All right, so intersectionality as a religion, I just want to go a little further deeper down the road. So we make up our own corpus of literature. We grant ourselves promotion and tenure from making stuff up. We cite other things in this made-up, make-believe land. We then start teaching this to students. It becomes literally it becomes part of the canon of knowledge. Literally part of we create a very intense structure so that anybody who even anybody who asks someone for a conversation about it is a heretic, is a blasphemer.
There's a lot of punishing of apostates.
A lot of punishing of apostates.
Keeping out.
A lot of punishing of apostates.
And heretics.
Yeah, and then this. So when the woman from the Demore event is on the police officer's talking to her, and she's screaming about the cis white patriarchy, heterosexual normative capitalism, hegemonic bullshit. She doesn't just pluck those terms out of the air. She's been taught this. She's been taught this by what Steven Pinker calls, it's not that people lack morality, it's that they're too moral, in a sense. So this invitations, everybody's here is very civil tonight, we appreciate that. What we see happening in college campuses now is a direct manifestation not only of anything or everything that's been influenced by postmodernism, but the nucleus of this problem lies in gender studies. It is the core, it is the epicenter that is metastasizing throughout our universities. And to call it out, to question it, and then that's the other thing, we talked a little bit about be offended. There's the other fascinating concept of you can now be offended on someone else's behalf who is not offended. Let that sink in.
Policing the shape of the moral community.
Policing the shape of the moral community.
Making sure heretical ideas can't make it into the core of the community, which might disrupt the moral community and make the meaning-making structure, control structure fall apart.
This makes sense if you understand, well, it doesn't make sense, but if you understand society as constructed by dominant discourses, if we believe that we can make social reality by how we talk about things, then it becomes really, really important to control how things are talked about. Throughout history, we have seen well-intentioned people murder, kill, execute, torture heretics, religious heretics, because they truly believe that they will send people to hell. So it is absolutely essential not to have these ideas out there which are going to damn people. What we are seeing at the moment is very different because we are in a different historical phase. We don't think that way, most of us don't anyway, anymore, but we are looking at a social reality now, and the idea that if there are people who are saying things which could be considered racist, they could be considered sexist, perhaps they're saying women have lower degrees of some ability or lower degrees of some interest in some things, they believe that will actually make that happen. If that's a common understanding, women don't enjoy this, that will make that happen. So it is really, really important to not have that as a dominant discourse and to have the right discourse up there that men and women are identical, they all like the same things, that race is, that white supremacy is controlling society, and that we need to readjust everything. And because speech actually can be violence if speech constructs reality.
Yeah, many mythological religions are with deities. You have this concept of a devil, and in this case, in those cases, what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep people out of the hands of the devil. If they get the hold of the wrong ideas, they take up the wrong behaviors, the devil's going to get them, or has gotten them, or something along those lines. They're going to fall into sin and go to hell and be with the devil. And in this situation, the devil is hate. That capital H word hate, like no hate. Everything that doesn't support the narrative against oppression from their perspective is construed as hate. You're hate mongering, and everything in the whole world has to be, and their whole worldview, moral worldview, has to be constructed against fighting hate. Hate is, of course, made into a fairly ambiguous term. This talk we're giving right now is certainly hate, which I'm not sure how that works. But that has to be stopped lest there be a return to greater oppression, greater marginalization, or perpetuated oppression and marginalization of people, rather than some emancipatory or equity-based project that they seek to
Okay,
to
so
go
we're almost for Q&A. I want to bring some things together that we haven't talked about. So one of the things that truly drives me insane, that I see it all the time, I can't even look at my PSU emails anymore, or my emails from my kids' schools, is that they have smuggled in the word equity.
in a place of equality.
In the place of equality.
That's another Trojan horse term, yeah.
Yeah, so we need to talk about, so equity does not mean what you think I don't even know if they know what it means. But it's very interesting, and if you look at just look at your, don't believe me, look at your PSU emails. You almost never see the word equality. What is the difference between equity and equality?
It's difficult to say, because a lot of the time, I mean, if we're looking at Christina Hoff Sommers, if she's talking about equity feminism, she's talking about equal opportunities. Right. And she's contrasting that with gender feminism, which is identity politics. But then we also see a lot in the last few years of equality meaning equal opportunities, and equity meaning make all outcomes fair. So if you're talking about equity in that sense, in that the end result of everything needs to be exactly the same. Right, and how do we achieve, do you want to toss onto that equity or equity-equality distinction?
Generally, in the sense that I've run into, of course, there's some nuance because different people use the terms differently, which is very difficult. Equity, from this perspective, often means equality of outcomes, where we're going to force some kind of a shape or a quota. So with the Google event, or the Damore event that happened the other night, there's a situation where they were talking about how Heather Haying mentioned that there were, Google was hiring at roughly or very nearly the same rate as computer science professionals were being produced, or graduates were being produced. So they were hiring, it's a 4-to-1 ratio at Google, mostly across tech, or roughly that. And it turns out that computer science graduates are also roughly coming out at 4-to-1. But equity would be, well, if half the population is women, so therefore half the population of Google software engineers should also be women. Equality of outcomes measures whether or not sexism is actually occurring. So in that sense, equity is very different from the equality that we think of in a free liberal society, which is that everybody gets a fair shake, nobody's discriminated against, and everybody has an opportunity to step up to the plate. And if you're qualified, you can get hired without your identity impacting you negatively, without discrimination, which is what often we think it means, but it often is used in application to mean that, oh, look, we have a 4-to-1 ratio of men to women in software engineering at Google. This is proof that there must be sexism in the tech industry, because equity is not being achieved. Therefore, there must be sexism driving it, and that's really where you have the problem there with that. And that's a natural result of cultural constructivism, of believing that. Define that. Believing that all of our traits, all our abilities, psychological, cognitive, behavioural, are learned from society, that nothing is innate or inherited. Whose book completely destroyed that?
That would be Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. That everybody should be reading that. There's
2003.
Also, there's a wonderful debate between him and, is it Elizabeth Spelker? Somebody Spelker, anyway, on YouTube, which looks, in which they compare cultural constructivism and, you know, biological differences.
Yeah, I want to talk about that very briefly. Another parallel to the diversity. I'm thinking all these terms. Only in third wave intersectional feminism and theology do you find rampant biology denialism. You don't find anything, I don't see it anywhere else except in intersectional feminism and theology.
Maybe environmentalism sometimes as well, but yeah.
You know, I said something to Brett, and he said, well,
ecology.
He said you find it in ecology somewhat. I can't speak to that, but there is an element, and you saw this in the debate with Nicholas Mate and Jordan Peterson, there is an element of biology denialism that I find deeply disturbing. And the fact that all of these parallels, and I hope that I've done a reasonable job in explicating what these parallels are, it's just interesting to me that so many people who consider themselves new atheists either don't see it, they don't want to see it, they don't pick up on it, they're afraid to say anything about it. Of course, the mechanism, the defense mechanisms from racist, bigot, all the way to Nazi, they're pretty intense for you to not speak up about it. And then there's the offended card, which constantly, I'm offended, she's offended, this guy's from Samoa, he's offended, everybody's offended, I'm offended for this guy who knows someone from Samoa who was on vacation there. I mean, the whole thing is so crazy that it's amazing that we haven't created, that this idea hasn't gotten out more. And Andrew Sullivan published a piece on this, and that went viral, and I think then we started talking about it a long time ago, and then Sullivan picked it up, and other people are picking it up. So I think we're at the beginning of a wave here talking about this. But unless we can speak honestly about this problem, we are simply not going to solve it.
Yeah, I don't think it's surprising at all that new atheism hasn't picked it up, to be completely frank with you. I think what gets called new atheism, which kind of erupted starting, say, 2003, 2004, really started with Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith, which is 2004. Richard Dawkins is, of course, its most famous face, probably. I would say that you have kind of two camps within that, which are like the rationalist, skeptic type people, and then you have a whole lot of people who were really, really pissed off that Christianity was anti-gay, and it became a woke religion. I seriously think that the atheism movement was a huge hotbed of becoming a woke religion. So I'm not at all surprised that the atheism movement that now exists has not jumped on this, because they are one of the major wings of it.
And what was the article in The Atlantic about recently, and then we'll get to
there was an article that came out in The Atlantic in the last day or two, I just saw it today for the first time actually, that argues that rather than thinking of identity politics, or in this case intersectionality, and I don't know if this guy's right or not, but rather than thinking of it as a religion, and it's interesting because religions have things like we talked about at the beginning, like mythological structures and things, and there's Crenshaw led into Patricia Hill Collins, who came up with a matrix of oppression, that all of society's discourses construct a matrix of oppression, that's how oppression works, and that's behind intersectionality. That might be mythology. There might be a lot of mythological constructs like the hero versus the villain versus the devil, and good versus evil. Lots of this kind of stuff is worked in there. But it's not as clear that they have a developed mythology as, say, Hinduism, which has a very well-developed mythology, and we easily identify how the mythological portion works there. So what the argument was forwarded in The Atlantic is that what we're actually seeing, and this may actually explain some elements that we see in political movements on the right, on the left, even within various factions, is that we now see people who are lacking religion and searching for it, and they're acting out its basic shapes. They're excommunicating people, they're driving purity, they are judging and burning apostates, heretics. What's that?
Metaphorically or professionally?
Mostly professionally right now.
And the other thing that you see that's so interesting is what's happening at this event tonight. Just think about it. We are three liberal atheists, and they, without going into my own situation, what people at this university have attempted to do to me, look where we are. the two most conservative groups are hosting this discussion. That is extraordinarily, you should be proud, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, you know, the free thinkers could have hosted the discussion, but this is not a discussion that people want to have, yet this is a discussion that we have to have. And I think when you understand that, you understand something that's unique in this culture war, where I think Andy No tweeted out strange bedfellows. You know, these are very strange bedfellows that 3 or 4 years ago would be unfathomable that I'd be sitting here with the two most conservative. Now I'm very delighted and incredibly grateful that you put on this event. And these are strange times, but it is interesting that this is, criticizing phrenology does not make you a liberal. Criticizing phrenology does not make you a conservative. Phrenology is a dumb, it's stupid. Intersectionality is worse, far worse. And it's being institutionalized, it's being taught, people are making shit up, they're credentialing themselves, they're using this to sit at the adult table so they can participate in conversations. It is an extraordinarily dangerous ideology.
That's the most scary part with the sitting at the adult table. You see more and more and more where some idea that seems extremely dubious, say about race or some other intersectional concern, gets forwarded and somebody pushes back against it and they say, well, there's studies saying, there's peer-reviewed journals, articles saying, and then they cite somebody that's come up with some idea, for example, Allison Bailey, who's come up with this idea called privilege preserving epistemic pushback, which says that me as a privileged person, if I get my privilege threatened, I'll push back against that in order to preserve my privilege, to make sure that I can keep that. And so if I don't agree, in other words, then I have something, I have the wrong bump on my head, and therefore I can't criticize the phrenology. Because
you're exhibiting behavior which proves that you are having
it's a
problem in
Kafka
the
trap.
first place. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like where Helen just now, by speaking on my behalf, is actually exhibiting internalized misogyny and seeking male approval.
Yeah, so there's, no matter what you say, you can't win. You know, when we did the Demore event, well, you don't have a black person up there. Okay, so what if we get 4 people, James Demore, and 3 physically challenged lesbians in transition? What then would the criticism be, right? The criticism would be that, well, they're not really black people. Well,
yeah,
they don't represent.
But that they're seeking approval from the existing power
Uncle
structure.
Tom's.
Yeah, they're seeking approval from the existing power structure. So the whole thing is built, that's the island epistemology thing, where if somebody's outside of the knowledge production and they challenge it, then that's seen as being invalid. It's not that somebody outside of the system is presenting a logical argument that should be discussed. They are actually presenting something that can't possibly be valid for unfalsifiable reasons.
Which is another similarity.
That's the core thing. I could sit here and talk about these things, and they can say, well, that's just because you're trying to preserve your privilege. And how am I going to falsify that? What could I possibly say? Because if I say, no, it's really blah, 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 they can say, well, that's you preserving your privilege further. It becomes unfalsifiable. There's no way in which I could possibly defend myself without them having a card to play that says that's reinforcing exactly what we just said about you.
Right.
So it's exactly the same kind of thing that you see often when faith structures go like super fundamentalist.
All right, cool. So let's do this. I think we've drawn the parallels. I think we've made the lines. I think we've explained things. But please, if there are any questions, dissenters, please go first. Yeah, and I think it's small enough. There's no mic. We don't need anything. Just yell at your question, and then we'll field them. Oh, and one more thing. Just say your name first, if you don't mind.
I'm not a dissenter. My name is Matt. My question is, so what practically, if we assume intersectionality is a religion, what does that, how should we change our strategy in terms of combating it, compared to fighting a non-religious political ideology? Like how is the strategy different because it's a religion?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure. To be honest, maybe you'd be best with the psychology of trying to understand what is beneath it, trying to meet people where they are. And I think we spoke about this before. If we can talk to people, if we know what is actually underlying, what just seems like inconsistent and even hypocritical nonsense, if we understand this perception of an imbalance of systems of power, you can at least then meet people where they are. You can see what they're worried about. They might seem to be totally inconsistent if you are saying this, if you are being racist and you're white, then you're racist. But if you're saying the same thing and you're black about white people, you're not racist. That seems mad unless you understand the systems. So, I mean, one thing I really appreciate about being brought here by groups which are sort of broadly conservative is that there has been a tendency for some on the right to oversimplistically conflate postmodernism and intersectionality with Marxism. There has been attempts from other sections on the right to conflate everything with sort of sexual liberation, reproductive freedom and other sort of things, and generally to miss what is really underlying a lot of these problems, which is the epistemology, the whole structure of it with objective truth, the denial of objective truth, the systems of power. Because it's complicated, it really does. You really do need to actually try to understand the mindset. So I think, yeah, trying to understand how much of it is emotionally driven, it does help you to address it.
My answer would be very brief. We must work on a way to defund gender studies.
Hell yeah. My answer is a lot different. A lot different. I don't actually disagree here, but for me, my concern is secularism. And I don't define a lot of people call intersectionality, if we're going to put it under a religious umbrella, they'd say it's a secular religion. And I understand where they're coming from because it doesn't rely on God. I don't care. It's not secular. Because secularism means that no particular ideology is being forwarded and getting special treatment. And so the answer to an ideology getting special treatment is to make them prove their claims on a level playing field, to take away the special treatment. Okay, so you have these intersectional claims. Fine, prove them. Go gather data. Come sit at the real adult table.
We can't even get them to come up for a conversation with us. How are we going to get them to prove?
I realize that. And when they don't, what you can then do is point out that the way that we operate, whether it's a political system, whether it's a physical system of the universe, chemistry, or whatever you want to have, scientific system, if you want to call it that as an oversimplification, what we have is that people come up and they try to investigate it by legitimate methods, and they try to prove themselves. And if they're not willing to, that means that they're putting forth a model that they're not willing to defend. The question is the model that you're using mature enough? We're going to try to go with a mature model versus immature model. So if we're going to combat it, which is a different question versus how do we treat it practically. If we're going to combat it, we have to say, I don't think your model is mature, and we have to be ready to show how. The best example of this, for those of you who are interested in the religious debate in existence, is that Sean Carroll did a debate with William Lane Craig in 2014 in New Orleans, where he basically stood up and did one cosmological model after another. He said, I don't know which one's right, and it doesn't matter. But it's a grown-up, all of these models are grown up because they do this, 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 and this. So if you have a mature political model, it should be able to tell you, this will happen, this kind of stuff happens under these conditions, and so on and so forth. What does your model do? And then where's the evidence that supports it? And if they aren't willing to have the conversation, we have to start having the backbone to say, well, you know, thank you for sharing that with me. We'll look into it.
Yeah, back to the kids' table is what I'd say.
More or less, yeah. If you can't back up your idea, then it's not playing on the same level. So it's not falling under the necessity that we have to maintain a secular society. So if it's a religion, it has to be treated the same way other religions are treated in secular society. Go have your belief. Believe what you want, privately. You don't get special treatment because you believe this with tons of conviction. Secularism means that your belief in your faith covers none of the distance to proving that it's true.
Conviction is not evidence of conviction.
Conviction is not evidence of much of anything except conviction, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing onto that?
Yeah, go ahead, and then we're going to go around to questions, yeah.
Best way to combat it is gentle humor.
Yes.
I mean, George Carlin, Bill Hicks, old school Ellen DeGeneres, they all took on religion in a huge way. And I would recommend listening to how they sort of deconstruct the deconstructionists and then have fun.
Yeah, totally.
I
I'm
mean,
just here on a
rock and roll.
diversity
All right,
quota.
we got a question from Tim and Poole in the back. Say who you are, by the way, just so that.
I'm Tim Poole, I'm a journalist.
All right, that's good, I guess.
Social media networks are siding against you.
Yes,
They tend to err on the side of intersectionality.
that's true.
Businesses and brands tend to. Even it seems, at least the perspective here is that the school has also done this by
That-
shrinking the room you've given access to, by not listing your event. If the entire system is not supportive of you,
I don't know. They may have listed the event. That I can't speak that. I don't. Yeah, but they are certainly not happy.
if the most powerful influences in news media are actually considered, Oxford said this, that the mainstream media is left, is liberal, this group, more willing to side with this, how are you expecting to combat it at all?
I mean, Galileo stood up to the church, didn't he? And they were setting people on fire for saying stuff like what he said, and he stood up to the church. It's bit by bit, and small meetings where we encourage open dialogue, we encourage the roots of liberal society, we remember where we came from in liberal society, we continually remind people of, Helen and I wrote an essay about the fruits of modernity, and we said that the religious fundamentalists, which we called pre-modernists, are the mirror image of the far left ideologues that we call post-modernists, and that they're really kind of the same thing. They're arguing for a fundamentalist principle where their situated knowledge, their identity, or in some sense really their identity or their connection to whatever they believe is the source of truth, trumps the liberal process of discussion, dialectic, argument, and debate. And we stand up for that over and over and over again with a 500-year track record. If you look at the history of the whole world, you pretty much have a flat line of progress. It's a little jiggly. And then all of a sudden you invent liberal science, liberal knowledge production, where we put forth ideas, hypothesis-driven ideas, and then we try to falsify them and keep the ones that aren't falsified. And we take them as provisionally true till we get a better one. So it goes along, and then look at the last 500 years. The curve goes like that. There's tremendous evidence, so we keep speaking on behalf of the process. We keep speaking on behalf of this is a process that works. I don't know the answers. You don't know the answers. Most of us are going to put out ideas. Most of our ideas will be wrong. Doesn't matter how smart. Doesn't matter if you're a doctorate or in any field or whatever. Experts are more likely to be right in their field of expertise, not necessarily outside of that. And we argue in terms of that process. If you want to put forth an idea, if you want to say that intersectionality is true, and I say, well, I don't think so, and you say, well, that's because you're a racist. Get out of here. I want to hear why you think it's true. I don't want to hear some crap that tells me I don't get to talk. So we argue in terms of the process, and we argue in terms of trusting the process. That's how we ultimately combat that, because we have at least 500 excellent years of proof. I got here on an aeroplane. That's what we call them. I'm kidding. We don't call them aeroplanes. I got here in a jet aircraft, and as Louis C.K. said, I know this is a taboo guy now, which is also kind of a thing, but he said it's like you're flying through a metal tube at 1,000,000 miles an hour or whatever it is. It's amazing, right? This is a whole new world that was inconceivable not long ago. The idea of the cell phone, that we can communicate with anybody in the world nearly for free, all over the place, instantaneously, this is almost inconceivable. So we have a huge track record that this process works, and all we have to do is stand up for it repeatedly, honestly, and without letting people have special treatment because they don't want to play.
And not apologizing for
without apology. Yeah, you're welcome for modernity is what experts should be saying.
We are the majority. That is what we argued as well. It may seem as though the extremists on either side are the loudest, are the most powerful, and depending on which side you're on, it's the other ones which seem like the existential threat. But in reality, most of us value science, most of us value reason, most of us value secular liberal democracy. So if we can differ on all sorts of things, economic to social, but generally agree that things have got quite a lot better in the last 500 years and we want to keep working on that, then that majority can actually push out the lunatics on either side by trying to, again, re-normalise an expectation that what you claim will have evidence and it will make sense.
Yeah, and Schirmer's The Moral Arc is great for that. And I'll tell you one more thing, Tim. The reason I think these folks are going to lose is because they don't value a dialectic. Because the values they hold are not rationally derivable. They're almost completely arbitrary. They're completely made up. And they will never be a great defender of intersectionality because there's no 1 Peter 3:15. There's no idea that you should defend your faith to it. There's no intersectional apologetic. I think they'll lose. I just don't know when they'll lose, and I will admit to you that they've taken over the universities. The far left is absolutely winning right now. Is that true from your experience? I mean, are you the conservative groups in the minority here?
Yeah, for now.
To say the least, and for now, yeah, for now. And I think, like Jonathan Haidt, we need a balance. Kids come to this university, they should be taught by liberals, they should be taught by conservatives, they should be taught by people who are totally indifferent, that we should throw a couple libertarians in there, a couple communists, a couple Freemanites. I think that they truly need intellectual diversity, diversity of ideas and opinions, and I do think professors ought to bring those opinions to bear on their subjects. Yeah, yes, sir.
I guess I would add one thing onto that, which is I think as more people stand up, you get these really gym moments like the Harris Ben Affleck or the Kathy Newman Jordan Peterson that shatter through.
Wonderful.
Echo.
Great comment.
But one thing I wanted to bring up was the idea of faith. We were kind of like talking about whether that was part of intersectionality, and I wanted to bring up the fact that I think there's a utopia that they have conceived of, which is this idea of equity without tyranny, right? Like equality of opportunity being achieved without any sort of tyranny. And I guess I wanted to see if you guys could play off that. Because with the utopia, I think anything becomes defensible.
I would go further even than saying that this is just utopianism. Utopianism is the idea that some perfect state of society is achievable. And I would go a lot further than saying that it's utopian. I would say it's Calvinist. This is Calvinist theology that took God out. This is you are born a irredeemably depraved, privileged person, or a sinner. I mean, I got that backwards. I forgot which one I was talking about. And that if you are born in part of the, if you're born in part of the part of the elect, the not nobly oppressed, sorry, the elect, then you're going to have, a lot of, so I think this is actually almost a Calvinist structure. And the Calvinist theology is actually, I don't know how much Calvinist theology you know, but it's an interesting theological structure, that people are born as they're born. The elect are the people chosen by God before they were born, that they're going to go to heaven. Nobody else is. Everybody else is damned by irresolvable depravity, irredeemable. But nobody knows who the elect are. And so everybody has to work toward building God's kingdom on earth to maximize the situation. So the goal to build God's kingdom on earth is a kind of Christian utopianism. And that's a very Calvinist theology. This is very, very similar to that. The goal is to build some future utopia where there is absolutely no capital H hate. There is absolutely no discrimination. There is absolutely no oppression, absolutely no marginalization, or any of these things. Of course, that's what they put on paper. But in reality, what tends to happen is that that if you look at it like there's a pyramid of oppression, you have the pinnacle, cis, straight, hetero, white, male, maximum privileged people. And down here, you have the more and more oppressed people, and it's really very bad. It seems like what you want is to create a rectangle and create equality, and that's the utopian picture. But what actually happens is that they're trying to invert the pyramid. And then what happens when you invert the pyramid is that the pieces fall down from the sides and you have a new pyramid with different people on top, a new priest caste. And so I would say that this is actually a very, very similar drive to create a perfect world. That perfect world is predicated upon not having hate, just like the Calvinist perfect kingdom is one in which sin is minimized.
All right, we're going to see if we can grab, yes, ma'am, yes, young lady, no, Sylvia. I was pretending I didn't know you.
I was wondering if you could describe the relationship between three things: intersectionality, social justice, and today's political left in the United States. And what I mean by social justice is not small s small j, we shouldn't deprive people of equal opportunity, but that Trojan horse term, the capital S, capital J, social justice. The drive to find oppression at all costs when, for all appearances and based on evidence, things are getting better, not worse. So first of all, I'd like to know, do you see intersectionality and social justice as related, delineated, maybe one being a subset of one another, and how do these things relate with the current political picture? Because we're seeing a political realignment in the United States. Do you see the concept of intersectionality and social justice related to this political realignment?
Yeah, well, I can certainly talk about the link between social justice and intersectionality. I might then pass on the American left to
Probably Peter for that one.
to Peter, yeah. But yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, we have come to a place post-gay pride, post-civil rights, post-second wave liberal feminism, where there is still a drive for equality. There is a recognition of past wrongs, and we are still very much, as a mainstream society, both American and British, aiming at this refining of the situation, of improving the lot of everyone. And intersectionality is just one of the next wave of critical theory, which I call identity activism. So it has it's spread out from postmodernism to become explicitly political and to claim its place as the successors of gay pride, feminism, etc. But intersectionality, yes, it takes in post-colonial theory, and it takes in queer theory. So it's bringing in LGBT rights, it's bringing in trans identity, it's looking at previously colonized and enslaved people. It's the whole mass of recognition of past wrongs, of things still to aftermath, still to level, still to work on. But it's taken it in a different direction that does come from the universities, but it has become distilled and sort of condensed into something that activists can use. The mantras of intersectionality, the mantras of social justice, which have really moved into mainstream leftist social conscience and into the media, from the universities, into many sort of large institutions, which then is putting pressure on the political left to provide policies, to provide rhetoric which satisfies this urge for social justice, which has become, as you say, the capital S, capital J ideology, which is really quite warped. Was that confusing, or did that clarify at all?
It's so related. Yeah. So
Yeah.
It sounds to me like you're saying it's a subset of one claiming success.
It's spread out. It's become more mainstream, diversified.
Jim, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I might add that the capital S, capital J social justice, which, by the way, one of my things is it doesn't work in speech, it works in writing, is that I'm against capital social justice because I'm for lowercase social justice. That's my liberal cred for the day.
Explain that. Unpack that.
So I'm against the social justice activism that's pissing us all off because I want to have equality. I want to have a society where nobody's discriminated against. Does anybody want to be discriminated against? No? Okay, let's get rid of that. I want that to happen, and I don't think that the capital S, capital J version is doing it. But I think capital S social justice, I'm not going to keep saying both letters, I think that is the thing that's posited in opposition to the capital H hate. And so capital H hate is the problem that's at the root that causes the oppression, that causes, when they say hate, this is like a buzzword, a popular term now, but it actually means marginalization, oppression, discrimination, racism, sexism, and so on. All of these kinds of marginalizing and oppressing type behaviors and speech and all of that. So I think the S and the J there come into that. Where critical theory happens, just to add to what Helen said, which is a little disconnected from what I just said, not to be confusing, is there's actually a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who talked a lot about the symbolic power structures within society in a very postmodern way. And he talked about critique in particular, or critical theory, the role it plays is to create opportunities in which you can challenge, you can raise new questions, challenge existing hierarchies or systems of power in new ways, and create platforms upon which activism can take place. And the idea is that all through history, if you look back, you know, women couldn't vote. People were enslaved. You look back and you just find all these things that were wrong. Well, currently, the assumption is, compared to some future state, 80 years from now, people are going to look back and think, wow, in 2018, we were all a bunch of racists, ableists, whatever, sexists, and all this. So there's this huge amount of disparity between proper justice and what we'll think is proper 80 years from now, that we're just as bad as if we look 80 years back or 200 or whatever it happens to be. And so what you have to do, because when you look around in reality, you don't see a lot of that. You think, wow, we've made a lot of progress, you know, in the past, say, 50, 60 years especially. There's a lot of equality that didn't happen. We've got post-civil rights, we've got post-second wave liberal feminism, a lot of success stories there. So the feeling is we have to look and problematize as many things as we can to create those nuclei in which we can start to tear apart oppression, whether it's still there, whether it's big or not, and make as many opportunities to overcome our problems with hate in general, to achieve social justice as fast as possible. And everybody continues to suffer until we do that, who's marginalized. Therefore, we have to find these things as quickly as possible to try to speed social progress. And that's where it starts to bleed into the social justice activism. Of course, this has been taken up by the American left, I think because post-civil rights especially, post-second wave liberal feminism especially. We have a very interesting left side moral architecture in the US, and it's actually more broad, but especially in the US, where the...
Can I wrap it up? Because I want to get a couple more.
The gravity of being oppressive, racist, sexist, etc., is such an unforgivable sin that people want to avoid it desperately. So I think that's how it ties into the left's moral architecture, thus the political left's behavior.
All right, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to try you guys ask a question, and we're going to try to answer it in under 30 seconds. So that way we can bang out the questions. Yes, sir.
So in the intersectionality religion where hate is the devil, it's Satan, what is the parallel of God or the Savior?
That's much harder. I don't know that there's actually a parallel. Like drawing a direct parallel to Christianity isn't like a savior isn't necessarily the greatest thing. You could actually see the mantras that they're thought champions at the moment, which seem to change really fast. Bernie Sanders was a huge one last year. You can see these as messiah figures if you want, who are trying to come and rescue everybody from, in that case, primarily capitalist oppression. If you want to see his social democracy in that sense, his figure, and I'm not going to let you guys off the hook, conservatives, Trump was a messiah figure too, by the way, to save you from a feminist and liberal agenda. Okay, that's what happened there. That's why he got elected. He's a messiah too. So I don't know that that's the best way to look at it, but like I just said, the opposite of hate is social justice. So I don't know that that's a God figure, but
there's no analog. There's
not necessarily an analog, but the goal is what drives moral purpose, what makes the moral community operate, what's the inherent good that if you take that extra O out becomes God, is a world without hate, a perfectly non-discriminatory, non-oppressive world.
That's salvation.
That's salvation,
all right,
yeah.
I'm going to see if I can bang as many as I can out. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, hey there, Peter. I'm in your critical thinking class.
Hey, how's that class going for you?
So far, so good.
Extra credit.
One thing I want to get to, going back to the Kimberly Crenshaw example, was just her initial observation. Do you agree or disagree with the idea that someone who's, you know, black, trans, queer, and so forth, that is the unique level of oppression?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I mean, if you're asking if somebody has all possible imaginable marginalized identities, is this a reality? Then I certainly think discrimination does exist. I mean, I think class is so much neglected within intersectionality that if you had a disabled, trans, black, lesbian who's also a billionaire, they're probably not oppressed. But yeah, I mean, if you're asking, do I think intersectionality actually works and that a lot of different marginalizations can happen and have an impact, I think it does.
All right, we're going to see if we can answer each of these in 30 seconds. Yes, in the back there.
Yes, I'm having a hard time telling from this conversation. Are we trying to conflate or relate women's studies, gender studies, and intersectionality?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I'd view that. Why don't you want to take that?
Helen's.
Yeah, I mean, well, from my perspective, women's studies is often that predated gender studies. That often is more closely connected to radical feminism. I know a lot of the radical feminists have been annoyed about the shift to gender studies because they don't believe in gender. So I'm not sure if that's what you're.
I was trying to understand how you're handling those three terms tonight.
Right, well, the, gender studies and is certainly the new articulation of looking into women's issues, which has incorporated queer theory to an extent that women's studies didn't. Intersectionality is part of black feminism, womanism, and also takes in post-colonial theory and queer theory. So within gender studies now, we tend to find much more of a combination of all these different critical theories all at once, but intersectionality is largely the overarching umbrella. Individual academics can look at one specific area, but the intersectionality is what sort of holds it together generally as a field. Is that, do you?
That does help. I have another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So,
We love questions if you disagree. Those are our favorite questions.
I'm not sure I disagree, I'm trying to understand.
That's good. That's a great position.
So, in the 80s, when I was in college, I heard similar kinds of critiques of black studies and women's studies. And you've been around long enough, you must have heard similar kinds of.
You're not talking about me.
Oh, totally talking.
The gray hair gives me to me every
Do you
time.
remember similar critiques of both black studies and, I mean, I remember our Women's Studies Center being defunded when I was in school.
Yeah, what were the reasons for that?
They saw it as unnecessary. They saw it as tangential. They saw it as problematic. Not core to the mission of the university. Yeah.
Yeah, that's coming from a very different place to postmodernism intersectionality. I mean, the women's studies in the 80s was very much divided between the radical and the liberal feminists, and both were getting some legitimate pushback, but also quite a lot of resistance from a yeah, well.
I mean the kind of critique from the established academy when women's studies and black studies tried to emerge, and there never was, while I was in school, a black studies program on that campus.
As far as I know, that I don't think so. I think that there's such a politically different time that I mean, my mother was doing women's studies at this point, and she had a lot of resistance, which was rooted in opposition to feminism, in opposition to women's rights. There was also some objection to the radical separatist feminists, which was a bit more reasonable. But I think that's such a difficult political situation then, with such different objections, it's quite difficult to relate to the objections that are happening now.
Yes, sir.
This is for you, Pete.
Oh, yeah, hey.
Do you feel, in regards to your book you published,
Yeah.
that SE, stream epistemology, would be a good inoculation for this train of thought currently, to have that discussion with somebody who thinks of it in a certain way, and to get them to reflect, to say, well, are my beliefs based in actual reality?
Yeah, I do. I think that this is a unique set of problems, kind of riffing off of what Helen has said. I think gently asking people questions about how they come to know things, as opposed to challenging their conclusions, so they don't invoke a defensive posture, they don't take a defensive stance. I think that is almost always a good thing. The problem that I have found in this case is that, let me give you a quick example. On my Twitter profile, I have a little image of a virus and duct tape on the virus. The virus is going into a brain, and duct taped on the virus is faith, and then it says moral virtue. And then I don't know the first thing about graph, like literally I'm looking for a slide designer. If anybody knows a really good slide designer, let me know. And I asked my guy who's been with me for years, who's designed slides, who is a friend of mine, and we have still have a great relationship, to take the word faith off of it and to put the word intersectionality on it. So now it is an intersectionality virus that has affected us all. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And here's a guy I have an outstanding relationship with. He's literally a world-class designer. I've known him for years. I've worked with him. He's been to my house for dinner repeatedly. I could still consider him a friend. We have this rather weighty disagreement, but there are some folk. I mean, look, I can only do so much. I can only invite people so many times before my own colleagues tell me, if you invite the people from the Women's Studies Department here again, they're going to complain, they're going to use the Board of Diversity and say that you're sexually harassing them. I mean, I invited them to it was James Damore and myself, and we invited 5 of the people to a tenure track, all of the tenure tracks. So that's the other thing. I can't just invite anybody, because if I invite people who aren't tenured or tenure track, people say you're punching down. They're not the best representatives. And I was very specific in the email. We were very specific. Andy sent the email. The email was for a conversation, not a debate. So if somebody doesn't want to have a conversation with you, there's nothing you can do to have a conversation, but that's the interesting thing about Christianity. I have found that in the Abrahamic traditions, people love to talk about their faith. I mean, I had no problem whatsoever. None. Zero. So I think that the tools in a manual for creating atheists are extraordinarily useful, provided that the people want to have a conversation. Someone doesn't want to have a conversation with you, like Jim said. I can't force anybody to have a conversation with me. I can only respectfully and politely ask. But then the other thing to remember is if you're going out in the street and you're asking people about their faith and about God and about Jesus, there's no diversity board, right? Now here there's a diversity board. So here if I say, hey, let's talk about... There's an
inquisition again.
It's like an inquisition. Hey, let's talk about your this or this, and they go to the diversity board, then... I mean, I know the secretary of the diversity board by name. I walk in there, hey, Dr. Boghossian, how you doing? I mean, so this is, we have organizational structures that make this a problem.
So besides, to add to that, because I'm going to preach on behalf of his street epistemology, actually, I think it is the tool. But the problem is that we're stuck in a place, first of all, where there is an inquisitorial structure that can be enacted. There's a power structure that can disenfranchise somebody trying to have the conversations, and it can be utilized still. Secondly, we're in a place where their answer is, well, it's in the Bible. But it's not the Bible, it's this canon of scholarly literature. And if you've ever had that conversation with somebody of faith, it's often very difficult to, well, you want to say, well, the Bible's 2,000 years old and maybe they didn't know as much. You want to get into that. It's very difficult. So you want to say, well, how do you know the Bible's true? And so then you can have a certain kind of conversation there because you've got like revelation and all this to draw from. Well, when you say that to people that are working in these theories, critical theory in particular now, all the fields touch on the earth thing, all things touched by critical theory as it's developed, you say, well, how do you know that's true? They say, well, there's a peer-reviewed paper in this prestigious journal that says it. And you're like, shit, what do I do against that? Because that's like the pinnacle of knowledge. That's the same thing that the scripture was like 1,600 years ago. Well, it's in the Bible, it's true. The priest said it. It's all in Latin, so nobody else knew what it said. It's unquestionable. And now it's like, this is in the highest echelon of scholarship. So one of the things that has to happen before those conversations are good, street epistemology is the tool. And for your average protester dude on the street or whatever, that's going to be the tool that you want to engage them with, cordial conversation, walk away if it gets scary. And then, but if you run into this wall, there's going to have to be, for it to be really effective, there's going to have to be a way for there to be a lot more awareness that there's some trouble going on in the canon of literature, that they're relying upon questionable methods, qualitative scientific studies instead of quantitative or more rigorous ones. They have their own epistemology that justifies it, that they have this self-referential system and make things look, so that's a huge problem right now. But yes, I'm going to say street epistemology is, the Socratic method is still the tool.
Yeah, I like his answer better than mine. I really wanted final thing that I really wanted to stress in there, as long as someone wants to have the conversation, it's the tool. If someone doesn't want to have that conversation, they don't want to have that conversation. Yes, sir, in the way back.
So this is, I'm very concerned with people who are, I don't know, I suppose, very captured by intersectionality rising in bureaucracies and things like that, in administrations. And I guess my question is about, we have laws about you're not allowed to practice, we have laws about separation of church and state, but we don't have any laws about separation of state and intersectional feminism. And is it worth, like, I don't know, reaching out to, I don't know, political people or
I think the part of the problem in my judgment is that people don't recognize that it's a religion yet. That's one of the reasons we want to put on this talk, and that's why I've been talking about it, to try to raise awareness. That's the big thing now. But no, I don't think that's. I just don't see that going anywhere yet. I think Jim's idea of, gently questioning and challenging and saying, hey, let's talk about this and let's engage conversations.
That really speaks back to what you asked about as well, where we talk about secularism construed broadly, which it is not. So separation of church and state should apply to all forms of morally motivated bullshit. But right now it can get under the radar because it comes off as a secular theology as opposed to a proper old school theology. So in a sense, creating this idea that the awareness, if you will, raising awareness that it's relying upon sophistry is kind of a critical step if you want to move in that direction to where it gets treated like other systems that operate on moral impulse or moral belief rather than on the broader liberal process.
Let's see if we can bang out a bunch of quick ones. Yes, sir.
Emerging religions are often driven by charismatic leaders. Is there like a John Smith or L. Ron Hubbard of intersectionality?
Andrea Dworkin.
I would certainly not say Judith Butler. She's the most uncharismatic person ever.
I don't think it's that kind of
Yeah.
I don't know that it's actually that kind of a thing. It's again, that's like a parallel to another kind of. This seems to be almost more. I really feel like this is a lot of people. The thing that I mentioned from the Atlantic, where it's people who've lost religion who are looking for it. I think that's more of the picture, and it becomes really frightening to realize the powder keg that now exists if that charismatic leader appears.
So I guess the follow-up question would be, do you think it's more or less dangerous without that charismatic leader, given the strength that it already has?
It's probably more dangerous, I would have said, because a charismatic leader can fall out of favour, your idol can have feet of clay. This is a movement that's snowballing, sort of getting more and more complicated, having more and more offshoots and spreading and becoming more normalised.
All right, we got time for a few quick. Someone who hasn't asked one. Yes, sir, in the back.
So Jonathan Haidt in a recent video that I watched seemed to imply that that intersectionality was kind of winding down, or this postmodern movement was winding down. Are you guys under that same impression?
Absolutely not.
No. Okay. And then what actions should a layman take for such thing? I mean, with the I'm
terrified when people ask me that question, because it's such a balance. When students come to my office to say the most important thing is to get your degree and then fight it externally, because I cannot even possibly tell you, and you've met them, you've talked about, I can't even possibly tell you the number of people who have come and said, hey, I've challenged something, I've questioned something, I've asked, and they've called me a racist, they've gone, called me a homophobe, when I'm just, so we've created an environment in which sincere inquirers are now punished for asking those questions. So it's a difficult question because you want to be authentic and forthright and true to yourself, but you also want to get your degree. So you have to be able to suss out your ability to ask questions about material. Because I think the thing to remember is, the word activist is found 7 times on the website in some variant thereof. And so they're not looking at this as a dialogue or dialectic. They're looking at this as an ideology mill where they want to indoctrinate you into intersectional ideas. And so as much as I believe in the legalization of marijuana, I'm pro-choice. I mean, I check all the boxes. I don't. My class, people set in my class. I don't indoctrinate anybody into I don't hide my beliefs either, but could you imagine teaching one of these classes and going in thinking you know the moral truth about something, and then you're going to tell people, and then that's the zeitgeist? So the other thing real quick is, it's always interesting to me that people who take these classes, they don't know the other side of the argument. Like, they've never read Martha Nussbaum's criticism of Judith Butler, which should be absolutely required. In philosophy, we do that all the time. We always look at, it's a dialectic, are the sides, different opinions, we take those, but that's not their goal. Their goal is to create activists. So you need to be very careful when you're in your university journey to not, you have to toe that line of being authentic and being true to yourself, but there's only so much bullshit you can take, you know, and you don't want to be that person who's called out. So it's a very difficult question, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I'm just being honest.
I think the layman's thing, the two words, be authentic. Just be yourself, and you know, don't necessarily be provocative.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you have to ask, you know, question, but you just be honest to yourself and really look. And, you know, the other thing is be open to intersectional ideas. You're sitting up here in a panel and it says, hey, these guys, 3 people say it's not good. Maybe I'm wrong about this stuff. Maybe it is a good idea. Maybe it can be tested. Maybe people find it. But right now, I'm not seeing it. But you shouldn't believe me. You need to look at all aspects. You need to find the truth for yourself. We need to create these moral infrastructures so that people can look at these problems. So I'm telling you exactly the opposite of what what they're telling you. You need to go to events like this. You need to go to, you're in the critical thinking class. Yeah, I encourage you guys to go to the counter events for the Demore talk. That's what you need to do. You need to see the perspectives. And if you do that, I think you'll be all right, and you can still get your degree. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. So, comment, I agree with Peter that it's scarier to be in the university and teaching, because last fall I came out of the Office of Diversity because I was teaching a course in cognitive science, and there I happened to also provide reference to you guys' paper of the hoax. The conceptual penis. Yes. And it's like, it's really scary how far they can take, and how far. I came out after a kind of elaborate kind of discussion. I got a clean sheet, but still my supervisor would not wanted to make my course PG-13.
Because you used our paper, the conceptual penis?
No, basically I taught a lot of moral judgment questions from a cognitive science point of view, and one or few students kind of felt that it was kind of hey, and basically the term they used was probably all these are new things for me, like I am a race traitor, and I'm internalized cis hetero white patriarchy, so all those things, and the complaint list looked like they made me feel like a super villain. Like,
I'm sorry,
and I was kind of shocked, because the list of complaints were all list of papers that I had assigned. So they had problems with academic papers, and there's like, if I can show that decision making, on average, there are differences between men and women. They found that sexist.
Right.
So I was just showing.
Did everybody catch that? That's key.
And
repeat that one more time. So the big thing right now is we biology denialism. We don't want to say there are differences between men and women. These are just social constructs.
Yeah. So I kind of basically gave an exercise saying that, okay, this is what I was talking about behavioral economics and judgment and decision. There I showed results where they showed they did certain experiments and say, okay, the loss aversion curve, or how white men judge things are different than how white women judge things, and so on for various social demographics. So I presented this in class, and they came back at me at the end of the course with a complaint saying that this is sexist and racist, just the presentation of this paper. And it's kind of pretty, and I agree that it seems like a safer place to talk about is outside the university. Like, I was just back from a meeting last week where like my supervisor wanted to kind of make my course less controversial, talk only boring things. And
the university has become a place where we have we don't like controversy anymore.
Kind of say that I do not have to teach this course. So I kind of basically said, I'm not going to, and then kind of like it felt like.
I'm sorry that happened to you.
So that is one. That was my comment. That the kind of question I have is, there's a lot of focus on theology, but I think there should be also. I felt based on my reading of intersectionality, there's a lot of implicit kind of desire for theodicy, the study of evil. They seem like more like, I think if there was any good point that I read about intersectionality is like they seem to want to solve problems. They want to identify some kind of evil in this world. Unfortunately, they kind of identify the wrong kind of evil, the wrong demon. Like for example, going back to my class, one of the heated discussions I had was I presented capitalism as not having any evil people involved. So basically it's like just market and there's nobody kind of a cabal of white men turning the knobs that are creating inequity. And to that the students kind of came at me saying that no, there is, and you do not know enough about the capitalist system to kind of so that's when I kind of got that they really have this kind of scientifically bad model of the source of inequality and evil. Capitalism does produce inequality, there's no doubt, but it's not because like few men are sitting somewhere and pushing the knobs, kind of maintaining the hegemonical structures.
Hegemonic, that's right, hegemonic.
So it's like so I felt that looking at it from the point of view of just evil, like models of evil might be a.
That was yours, right? So what's the God model? They're not worried about that yet.
So is it more like
it's not
the Pharisees then, where there's not really God, but they're authority figures that tell the followers
There's a
what
lot
to
of
think
priests.
and what to believe?
There's a lot of priests, but again, I don't know that's necessarily the thing to do to look for a direct parallel to another religion. I think it's a model where you want to look at the kind of patterns of behavior and what needs are driving those behaviors. And in this case, it's the eradication of evil, which is where I drew back toward Calvinism.
All right, we're going to see.
Kingdom.
Sorry, we're going to see if we can literally. I am holding us to 30 seconds. I'm getting my phone. Go.
Why do you think that atheists are looking for religion in intersectionality?
It makes meaning for them. It gives them an identity. It seems to give them a sense of purpose that connects to the good. They are making a world a better place.
Next one, go.
Would you agree that internal inconsistencies in intersectionality, such as, it's very problematic to discriminate based on race, but it's also very problematic to be colorblind, is similar to inconsistencies which occur in biblical texts?
Yes and no. The good thing is when you throw out all laws of logic and Aristotle's laws, all this, law of non-contradiction, that stuff doesn't mean anything. Reason, you just toss the whole thing out the window. Boom, defenestrated. Doesn't make a difference. Next, boom, go.
So I have a question. How do you argue or have a conversation with someone when they believe in things that are absolutely untrue, like the cabal of white men controlling the economy or things like that? How do you talk to someone? How do you get them to not believe that?
My app, Atheos, ATHEOS. It's free. It has everything you'll need on there. Go.
What would account for intersectionality?
Louder, louder.
What would account for intersectionality's ability to just kind of invite itself into every industry, like video games and English literature, and what is the mechanism that seems to make it infiltrate all sorts of different backgrounds?
Boy, I'm afraid that if we articulate that, they'll.
Phobophobia.
Yeah, all right. 30 seconds, go.
Fear of being labeled racist, sexist, etc. That's it. An
phobia.
overriding fear, paralyzing phobia of being considered bigoted.
Next, go.
Is the university the sacred place where you can't blaspheme, but everywhere else is okay? Was she
safe
turning
spaces
over
are.
the table, the money-changing tables by pulling the cord out because this is the sacred temple?
Safe spaces within, not the whole university. Most of the university is still okay.
Go, 30 seconds.
Is there hope?
Absolutely, 100%. There is absolutely hope because they don't have a dialectic, because they don't think their values are rationally derivable, because they don't know the other side of the case, because they don't have a 1 Peter 3:15, because they haven't developed a sophisticated apologetic, because every one of us can stand up to them and fight them, because we can make alliances with people who would make bizarre bedfellows in any other universe, because we can do. There's just absolutely hope, and I'm fighting these people. I'm just not going to let these people trammel on liberty and individual liberalism. I'm not going to let them smear other people as bigoted, racist, homophobic. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it, and I'm sick of what they're done, and they think they're coming for me. I'm coming for all of them. Yeah, nope.
So would you say the rejection of equality in favor of equity is sort of a concession that there are some superior groups to others, and they think that there has to be a system in place to raise others up to make sure everyone's equal or the same?
I don't think it does work like that. I think it's just so ingrained that some people have been kept down and other people have been unfairly elevated, that there's this kind of retribution and payback type of thing needed to rectify it.
I think there's a long view of equality. That's how the equity actually works. Where you see they asked Ruth Bader Ginsburg how many female justices means equality, and she said 9. And then so there's got to be all of them for a period of time to make up for the fact that they were all men for a long period of time. And then we can start talking about having a mixed balance for it to be the right number. So it seems like there's sort of a cultural reparations built into their view of equality, and that's being captured in equity.
We have one more. Yes, Andy. How could we have to have Andy know here?
Thank you. Dr. Lindsay, I've been thinking a lot about you describing how intersectionality is actually not a secular religion, and I think you can see that most clearly in how those who broadly belong to the movement are deeply, deeply protective of Islamic orthodoxy. I'm wondering if you, and maybe Helen can speak to this as a citizen of the UK, how this development happened. As in my time and my involvement with the free thinkers of Portland State University, it did genuinely really shock me to see a secular campus like Portland State tear down our flyers for an event on a film giving voice to free thinkers of Muslim background, those who have left their birth religions, tearing down those people tore down our flyers, plastered messages calling us atheist Islamophobes. And that to me in 2016 was kind of an eye-opening moment that we weren't just dealing with a scholar. The theories motivating these people was not just another theory in academia, but there was something more going on.
It is. It's the cultural reparations that James was talking about. In the UK, it's very much a post-colonial guilt issue. We're so conscious of having trampled all over other aspects, other cultures, neutral aspects, good aspects, that now they're trying to sort of overcompensate and make up for that by valuing absolutely everything indiscriminately and not evaluating according to consistent liberal principles on behalf of women or LGBTs. It's it's that I was saying to you, trying to restore this balance.
They've conflated race and religion in that case, and they see that you hear it all the time. They say it over and over again. Just listen to what they're saying. They say it all the time. We've gone and we've waged war on their region and stolen their resources. Really, we bought most of them, but we've waged war on their regions. We've trampled their stuff, and so that's a massive amount of that's major hate points. It's a lot of oppression that the West has foisted upon them. So they are very marginalized, and therefore they have to be very protected. That's it. It's really kind of simple in that sense.
All right, that's it. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Appreciate your time. I really sincerely want to thank everybody for their civil behavior, the discourse, the discussions that we had. Go out, look at other sides, investigate. Don't take our words for anything. Learn. You're in college. Look, open your eyes, examine for yourself. Have a good night.